Hello. Today we're going to be talking about something that's going to make you a better and more accurate photographer, and that is how to read and use your histogram. Let's go. So, we want to use our histogram to build a proper exposure at the moment of capture and be able to use that to make appropriate decisions in editing and in the field. Your histogram is a bar graph that shows the distribution of different values of pixels, meaning are they dark, are they properly exposed, or are they too bright? We lay them out in a bar graph with the left side being underexposed pixels and the right side being overexposed pixels. Think of the very middle of this bar graph and a standard deviation on either side, and you have about the 18% gray area, which we define in photography as properly exposed subjects. Now, if we move to the left, we're going to get darker and darker and darker values. If it touches the left wall, then that information is pure black, meaning you could lighten it in photo editing, but it will never produce more detail. It will just turn gray. The same is true of the right side. If I go that way, I'm getting brighter and brighter and brighter pixels, and I will eventually turn pure white, meaning I could darken it in photo editing, but at that point, it will never pull out more detail. So we want to avoid touching the walls. I would say that you should at minimum be shooting with your histogram turned on in review so that you can view it and see if you've clipped any of your information so that you can reshoot the picture if you need to. But I also would advise if your camera can shoot photographs with the histogram turned on in viewing before firing the picture, you should do that as well. It will help you make good decisions. And I'll tell you how. What we want to do as we're building our exposure shooting is we want to accomplish two things. The first is we don't want to touch the wall on the histogram on either side, losing information. And we also want the distribution of values in the histogram to match reality. For instance, if you're shooting a photograph of somebody wearing a black shirt, you should see a spike on the underexposed or the left side of the histogram. If you tried to move that into a bell curve distribution and make it lighter, what will naturally happen is that black shirt will turn gray, and that's an overexposed photograph. That's just not accurate. The same thing is true for white objects, animals with white fur, people wearing white shirts. That should be a spike on the right or the bright side of the histogram. It shouldn't be darker and thus turning gray. So we ideally would want these white and black objects to have spikes near their respective walls, but not touching them. So that's the way that I define a proper exposure. It doesn't touch either wall, and the distribution of values in the histogram match reality. So what we're going to do now is we are going to use that idea. We're going to build an exposure of a black microphone against a white background and use the histogram to inform us of what is an appropriate exposure.
We're going to start here with this totally black image, and this is actually information coming off as we're about to shoot. We're just very underexposed. So you can see the histogram in the bottom left, and it's just one line bunched up against the left wall, which means it's all pure black pixels. There's no information. And we're going to start opening the aperture here. And now we're getting to a point where we see that that spike just broadened out. So there actually is some information. Not very good information, but now it's going to start coming in here as we get to f2. And now we're going to slow down our shutter speed. So you see here, we're going to stop at a 200th of a second that we haven't changed the ISO. It's still at 100. We're now at f2, so we've brightened up through the aperture. And as we've brought in our shutter speed, we now have information that we can see, but we still have that spike on the left wall, which means there are still some pure black pixels. And so this is still not a proper exposure, but we have some information. We're going to keep slowing down our shutter speed. And we know we still don't have a proper exposure here at a 50th because we still have that spike on the left wall. And so this is still an underexposed photograph, but we now see that it's a microphone and it is against a white background. So now we're moving this, and some people might shoot and think that this would be a proper exposure, but at this point, you as the photographer and you thinking about your subject matter come into play. This is not a gray background, but it is actually a white background. So while here I have a little bit of underexposed pixels, this is not even yet really close to correct, because that spike that's in the middle of the histogram is really saying that we have now brought all of these background pixels into about 18% gray alignment, and that would actually be incorrect. So we not only want this to be technically correct, we want it to make sense with reality, meaning that the white background should not be gray, it should look white. So we need to keep brightening this. And right around, maybe one more little bit here. So we're getting really close at a 13th of a second. One more. And this is what I would say is the first usable exposure. You're going to notice that we've moved off the left wall. We still have room on the right wall before we start clipping the highlights, but now we have information throughout the frame. And that's really not bad. But I have this room on the right side of the histogram, and I have a white background. So what I'm going to want to do is try to push that histogram as far that direction as I can before it clips. So we're going to keep brightening this shot. We're going to move it over a little bit, and we're going to move it here. And I'd say a 1/6 of a second there is about as good as it's going to get. Because if I move there, you see we've moved to a 1/5, and we've started to hit that edge on the right side of the wall, we are overexposing some of those background pixels. And especially at a 1/4, we know that we are overexposing it. So I'm going to pull that back and say that something in this area, the 1/6 of a second, is to me the perfect exposure. I haven't clipped my highlights or my shadows. The white background looks white, and the black microphone holder and the actual handle of the microphone look black. So that looks like an appropriate exposure to me. Now I did that in manual, and what we're going to do next is change this so that we're actually in aperture priority mode set to f2. And when we do that, what we're going to see is what the camera believes is an appropriate exposure. And it immediately shifted us over to 1/10 of a second. So what it's saying there effectively is that the camera believes we need to actually be a little bit darker. What it's trying to do is bring that white background and make it grayer. But I know that I don't want it to actually look that way. I wanted it to be a 1/6 of a second, which means that not only are we learning to read our histogram, but we're learning to see why learning to read our histogram is going to allow us to be better manual exposure photographers.
So that is how you use the histogram to build a proper exposure, making sure that things look appropriate and that you have information when you are working with this image in photo editing. As always, my videos are brought to you by the website Camera Lessons Online, where I've got a downloadable 8-page introduction to photography brochure. I've got my macro photography book and my 4-hour course on intro to photography skills. I hope that you check it out. As always, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. It's free, you knew that, and I thank you so much for being with me today. I'll see you next time.